Hello, welcome back to Game Programming with Unity. Okay, this section is pretty cool. We're going to get on to setting up physics. So we kind of went over last section the basics of physics, what's happening, all the pieces of the puzzle that need to be there to get physics to work. Now we're going to look at passive physics, which is basically creating what I call a wall or a barrier, right? Because when we're dealing with physics, we have two things that can happen. The transforms of the object we have selected can be affected by the collisions with another object, or the transforms or the object that is a passive object can just simply be a barrier to the object that is trying to move through it. Right? So I'm just going to go over a little bit about how we create that barrier and how it can become an impediment to a moving object. So what I've got here is I've got a character, and I'm just going to hit play. I've got a little bit of a script on him, right? And that script allows me to control his movement. And I'm just going to go left and right arrows. We're going to control the left and right rotation, and the forward or the up arrow is going to move him in this forward vector, and the back arrow is going to move him in his backward vector. As you can see, I'm just moving him around. Let's just click on local. We can see that Z vector. You see his independent local vector change, and I'm just moving him forward in his local vector. But you can also see that that wall there does not act as a barrier at all. It doesn't impede his movement. So we want to set that up as a passive physics object. How do we create an impediment to movement but not have the object itself move? So let's just turn that game off. In order to create that relationship, what we need to do is create a collision volume, right? So we're going to create a collider. And colliders come in several different forms. Let's go ahead to component and go to physics, and let's look at our collider options. Okay, so we have a box collider. That's basically what this object is. It's a box. We have a sphere collider, which is a sphere. So it has a point from which the radius radiates, and that's the total volume that will be registered in red as a collision volume. And then we have a capsule. A capsule is kind of like a tube with rounded ends. And then we also have a mesh. Now, a mesh collider is based on vertices of an object. You have a fairly small limit of vertices that the physics engine will be able to calculate. I believe it's 255 triangular faces that it will be able to calculate as a mesh collider. Now, mesh colliders are much more accurate. However, they require a whole lot more CPU time, or GPU time. In this case, we're using PhysX. But it's a lot more expensive computationally, so it's fairly limited. Mesh colliders are really great for some things, but you need to be fairly accurate, like rounded objects. And they're also really great for characters and things. If you have a low-res character, you can use as your mesh collider. And that's fairly advanced stuff. For basic objects, we want to use basic stuff. There's also a wheel collider, and that is very specific to an actual wheel. Like if you're doing a driving game or a motorcycle game and you want the wheel to behave like a wheel would, then you use a wheel collider. And the terrain collider is specific to the terrain object, which is part of Unity's create terrain package. And we're not going to get into terrain too much, or at all actually, in this particular lesson set. All right, so what we want to create for this cube, or for this wall, is a box collider, because Unity is going to be smart here and just create a box collider as a component as it's done, and it's going to suck that to the exact shape of our cube object here, or our wall. And so I'm going to just change the size here. Now we can change the parameters of our colliders by editing the size. You can see it's getting bigger in the X. Maybe a little hard to see. These are volumes, so they're not filled in with geometry or with shaders. It's just an empty area, which we call the collision volume. So I can change the size, I can offset it, and I can make invisible barriers. It's very common to just create a simple null object and then create a box collider on top of that null object, and I've created an invisible barrier. So let's change all those back to where it was. Okay, so now I've created a passive collision object. So this should act as a barrier. But we still see that the ghost or our eye guy here. Kind of looks like a Pac-Man ghost to me. We can still see that he is floating through the wall. So we created a collider, but it's not colliding. Why is that? All right, well, that's because we haven't created a collision volume for our active character, for our eye guy here. So now I need to create a collider for him. So I'm going to select his parent object. And you'll notice he has a rigid body here. We're going to talk about rigid bodies in the next section, a little bit more detailed. But we are using that because I can't impede the movement of this character without having something that controls the movement based on physics. And that's what a rigid body does. But it's still not working because I don't have a volume with which this character is going to register any interaction. So I need to create a component, physics, and we're going to create a capsule collider. The reason for this is this guy is kind of tubular shaped. He could use a sphere, but you'd have a lot of wasted space. So we're going to click on Capsule Collider. And because he is not a Unity object, let's just change the height here, we're going to have to edit this collision capsule manually. And you can see it over here in our scene view. And it does not show up in the game view, once again, because we wouldn't want to see that when we were playing the game. Let's increase our radius, change our height, and we can even change the offset. So this best fits this particular collision primitive. We really want it to be as tight as possible. Now notice if we have pieces of the geometry that are outside, then we will have interpenetration. So we'd rather have a little bit bigger of a collision volume than the character. So these things will interpenetrate because this collision volume is going to register any collision that occurs. Okay, so now we have a collider for our character. Now, boom, you notice? Now he is no longer able to go through the wall. So there we have it. Really simple way of creating a passive physics object, just creating a barrier to your character's movement. It's just as simple as creating a collider for any passive physics object you want, and you must have a rigid body on the character that you're moving, because that character's movement will be impeded, so he has to have a rigid body. But anything else that is an impediment, like a floor, a ground, or a wall, uses just a simple collider. So let's just look at that cube. Here's that box collider. And then our character also has a capsule collider, so we know when those two areas or volumes intersect or collide.